Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to day four of the Gyan course on unraveling the problem of history, exploring African and Indian writing. It is a pleasure to have you all with us today. Today's session will be led by Professor Stefan Helgeson, and we all are familiar with him now, I guess so. In today's session, Professor Helgeson will be delivering two lectures on interconnected themes, followed by a tutorial session where participants can ask questions and engage in discussions. Before we begin, here are some important points to keep in mind. Please post your questions in the chat box and they will be addressed during the tutorial session. And your attendance is being recorded and the session is also being recorded for reference, and the session will be in two parts. The first will commence from 12:30 to 2:30 p.m. IST, and the second will be from 8:30 to 10 p.m. And there will be no break during the session, but if professor prefers a short pause, we will accommodate it. And the tutorial session will take place soon after the lecture, where we will engage in further discussions based on the lecture. Okay, now let us begin. I invite Professor Stefan Helgeson to deliver the first lecture on Gandhi's printing press in Durban and other oceanic approaches to African history. Please, sir.
Thank you so much for that introduction. Could I just double check the times you mentioned? Because in the latest version of the schedule I have, it says that let's see, my lecture. Aha, yes, okay, sorry. No, you're absolutely right. It says 8:30. I thought it was 7:30. Never mind.
Stefan,
That's perfectly.
Stefan, can you see this mask?
Sorry. Yes, I can.
Uh, these are African masks.
Ah,
Sorry,
in your
carry on,
in
carry
your
on.
home.
Yeah, no, this is
Yes,
office. This is Rizwan sir's
office.
office.
Okay, marvelous.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry, I double checked. Yes, the times were entirely correct. And just to clarify, I will. I mean, my two lectures today will be somewhat shorter than the ones I've delivered so far, and now it'll be on the oceanic approaches to history, and then in the evening, your time, I'll be talking about post-apartheid writing. Now, just before we begin, um, I just want to acknowledge that very interesting question that was posted on WhatsApp after um, yesterday's session, and I can. Yeah, so this is Chitra writing. As I understand it, the rise of expectation works with the hermeneutic of remembrance as Paul Ricoeur used it to conceptualize narrative as an inherently human ability to harmonize parts into an intelligible whole. How would this change for narratives which are discordant, as Gona's novels read as trauma narratives dealing with the problem of unrecoverability of past and the termination of the present in repetition? What will be the horizons of expectations then? That's a very perceptive and profound question. I haven't mentioned Ricoeur so far, but he lurks there in the background of my own thinking, and I think that question identifies precisely one of the key challenges that a writer like Abdulrazak Gurna is dealing with, the difficulty to make the past cohere and, so to speak, narrativize it in such a way. Instead, it is shaped by fragmentation and disconnection, which I suppose makes the achievement of many migrant writers all the greater in a way. I'm thinking here of the Caribbean poet Derek Walcott, who said that the love that is required uh, to put together a broken vase is much greater than the love that went into making it in the first place. Okay, so with that, perhaps we can project my slides for today.
Alina, please present the slides.
So, I when preparing this course, it just struck me that this should be of particular interest to you, and the ways in which the Indian Ocean and specifically Gandhi also then figures in African contexts, in South African contexts. Next slide, please. So, as mentioned, I have a much shorter talk today, but we will also be viewing part of a lecture by Isabel Hofmeyr as part of the sort of the tutorial session. But I want to begin by looking at what I call two oceanic paradigms of study, as this has become very influential in literary and cultural studies. And I'll then just mention a few literary examples of relevance, and end by a reflection on how this lecture, which really engages space, the oceans understood as space, how that sort of ties in with the more sort of temporal approach that I've been adopting in these lectures thus far. So, next slide, please. I assigned this this essay by Isabel Hofmeyr as part of the reading, the Black Atlantic Meets the Indian Ocean, which he published in 2007. And I should perhaps begin by saying something about Isabel Hofmeyr. She is a South African academic. She was a professor for many years at the Department of African Literature at Witwatersrand University in South Africa. She recently retired, but is still very active, and has over the years been extremely important in sort of reshaping the terrain of literary and cultural studies in South Africa, and has an international standing. So she's an important figure, and one of her most famous books is called The Portable Bunyan, a transnational history of the Pilgrim's Progress, which was published in 2004, and is really a study. I mentioned the Pilgrim's Progress in a previous lecture. Is a study of the African translations and the African distribution of the Pilgrim's Progress, which really was a big cultural phenomenon in the 19th and early 20th centuries, that occurred very much on the back of the whole sort of Protestant mission endeavor. And what one could see there in that book was how Hofmeyr cultivated a form of a book historical approach to literary studies. She focused very much on the actual books, their covers, the print, what had, how these objects had been circulating, and so on, in that study on the Pilgrim's Progress. And that sort of, that way, that method of following the object is one that she then has continued to develop. And when she wrote this article in 2007, she was just sort of embarking on sort of the Indian Ocean leg of her academic journey. Okay, so here is a short quotation from that article. The Black Atlantic, Hoffmeyer writes, has become a shorthand term for understanding the Atlantic seaboard as the site for the emergence of capitalist modernity as a transnational system. So the whole this article hinges precisely around the comparison between the Black Atlantic and the Indian Ocean. So we need to understand what is meant here by the Black Atlantic to begin with. Next slide. So I assume that you are familiar with this work. It's a book by Paul Gilroy, a big name in cultural studies in Britain. And the Black Atlantic was really his coinage, and he uses the term to name the transnational cultural formation shaped by the slave trade and its aftermath, the transatlantic slave trade. And it calls the Black Atlantic a counterculture of modernity. Okay, so what he's doing here is really two things at the same time. He's making the Black history of modernity visible. We need to recall that the transatlantic slave trade completely transformed the Western Hemisphere. Half the population of Brazil, for instance, with its I don't know how many million, 250 million or so inhabitants, half of that population has slave ancestry. The Black minority in the United States, as we know, is hugely significant, both culturally and politically. But this brings us to the second point that Gilroy is making. That was for a long time simply understood in national terms. It was a United States phenomenon, or it was a Brazilian phenomenon, or it was a Jamaican phenomenon with this sort of slave heritage. Gilroy's point is that the different Afro-diasporic cultures of the Atlantic, they were sort of in touch with each other, and they were not confined really by national borders. Instead, Gilroy sees sort of the ship as the true site of Black Atlantic culture. First in the tragic mode. I mean, the slave ships bringing Africans to the Western Hemisphere, but later also, I mean, these slaves and then descendants of slaves were, among other things, seafarers. They worked on board ship, and in that way there was this constant communication between these groups. Next slide, please. So this is Gilroy then. The contemporary Black English, like the Anglo-Africans of earlier generations, and perhaps like all Blacks in the West, stand between at least two great cultural assemblages, both of which have mutated through the course of the modern world, that formed and assumed new configurations. So the two cultural assemblages are essentially Africa and the West, by Gilroy's account, and sort of standing between those two requires, and this is a key term in Gilroy's work, requires the cultivation of a double consciousness. And this is a term that Gilroy borrows from the great pioneering American sociologist W.E.B. Du Bois, who in his very fine and important book, The Souls of Black Folk, from 1903, I think, articulated this notion of double consciousness. That for him it was a United States phenomenon at the time, but his point was that a Black American is forced to think of him or herself from two perspectives at the same time, both from sort of the subjective perspective of the self, but also has to understand that there's a white gaze that sort of defines who that self is. So double consciousness means having to sort of regard oneself both from the inside and the outside at the same time. And it's this double consciousness that then generates the critical potential, the critical impetus of this counterculture of modernity, and it's in that way Gilroy sort of provides an explanatory framework for the vitality and significance of Black expressive cultures, not least through music, which has become so globally influential. Jazz music, hip hop, rock music. It's impossible to think of contemporary music without taking the history of the sort of the Black Atlantic culture into account. Next slide, please. Now, this is sort of in the background of Hofmeier's argument here. But she's trying to identify the ways in which the Indian Ocean has a different cultural and historical logic. Once mastered by mariners, she writes, the monsoon enabled deep-sea travel and trade in the Indian Ocean. These trade networks were further consolidated and promoted by the spread of Islam in the Indian Ocean from the 8th century onward, which helped to weave together a series of cosmopolitan port cities: Kilwa, Mombasa, Malindi, Mogadishu, Jeddah, Aden, Muscat, Cambay, Calicut, and so on. This is beginning to be familiar terrain. I touched upon it yesterday when talking about Abdul Razak Gurna. And I think the enduring point here really is that the Indian Ocean has a much older cultural history, really, than the Atlantic Ocean, and that this is very much because of its sort of meteorological features. The monsoon winds that at one point sort of blow towards the northeast, then change direction and blow to the southwest instead, making it possible to travel by sail across this vast ocean. Next slide, please. And here is then a very central point made by Hofmeyr, that these intellectual circuits produced a world of cross-cutting and contesting universalisms, producing a view of colonialism less as an encounter of the local and the global than as a contestation of different universalisms. And this then becomes an interesting contrast to the Black Atlantic, which is so much more a history of exclusively a history of domination and exploitation, conditions under which slave descendants nonetheless have been able to assert themselves and prevail in different ways. But the cultural logic of the Indian Ocean and historical logic is then different. Next slide, please. So this is what brings us to Gandhi's printing press. And I don't know, some of you may have read Hofmeyr's work, and this particular notion, Gandhi's printing press, is actually the title then of one of her books. And what needs to be recognized here is that there is a significant Indian presence in South Africa. So beginning around 1860, increasing numbers of Indian laborers, and to some extent merchants, but mainly indentured laborers, arrived in South Africa. And by 1910, there were more than 150,000. And this presence has remained. If you were to visit Durban, especially the neighborhood of Chatsworth, I believe that you would feel pretty much at home. It has a strong sort of Indian character. And then, as you know, Mohandas Gandhi was active in South Africa for, well, more than 2 decades. And these were formative years in his life. It's when where he developed his satyagraha philosophy and pioneered forms of resistance that would then be pivotal in the Indian struggle against the British. So that's the historical sort of backdrop to Hofmeier's book. Next slide. So she's emphasizing here the cosmopolitan dimension of the Indian Ocean trade and cultural network. The epic mobility of 19th century imperialism, she writes, engendered a rich array of transnational imaginings as displaced and dispersed communities had to envisage their position in a new order. In these port cities, Arya Samajists, Theosophists, Sufis, Pan-Buddhists, Sikh transnationalists, African nationalists, white laborists, and those espousing imperial citizenship established transoceanic organizations speaking in global idioms. So in much of what she's done, Hofmeyr can be described as an historian of the empire, the British Empire, but it's obviously a revisionist understanding of empire. It's sort of tries to identify all the different communities that shaped and connected within the empire in ways that far sort of exceeded the British imagination of the empire. Yes. So next slide, please. So much of the book is focused then on this publication, Indian Opinion, which started publishing in 1903, and the image here is actually from an edition from 1916, which is after Gandhi had left South Africa. But I mean, Indian Opinion would continue to publish long after he left the country. But the book is focused on those early years. And one of the things that interests Isabel Hofmeyr is well, the specifics of printing and how they actually managed to pull this off. So this was a very small operation, really, in Durban, and the journal as such would never. I mean, it only reached the elite, you could say, among the diasporic Indians in South Africa. I don't think circulation really, at least under Gandhi's years, went beyond 2000 or so. So it was a small endeavor, and it was printed at the International Printing Press, which boasted of being able to print in 10 languages and 7 scripts. And this, I think Hofmeyr is entirely right in emphasizing that this is something quite remarkable. and speaks volumes of precisely that diasporic cosmopolitanism of which he speaks, the diasporic cosmopolitanism along the coasts of the Indian Ocean. Next slide, please. So it was called a newspaper, Indian opinion, but Hoffmeyer's argument is that it actually functioned as a gathering space for a variety of texts circulating around the Indian Ocean. So it would sort of reprint material, and it hardly respected what we today would think of as copyright, but nor would Gandhi insist on copyright for original material published in the Indian Opinion. So she's, in other words, looking at this object, the Indian Opinion, and trying to understand what was actually going on there. I mean, the fact that, as you can see here in this image, it was published in English and Gujarati, and I think in the beginning there were 2 or 3 more languages in Indian languages in Indian Opinion. Demonstrates precisely how it becomes this gathering space, but it only becomes legible to certain readers. And those readers essentially belong to the diasporic Indian elite. Now, one of Hoffmeyer's ideas in this book, the subtitle is "Experiment in Slow Reading," is that Gandhi, who was very sort of anti-commercial in his thinking, and in many ways anti-modern. He wanted the journal to be to sort of train the reader to read slowly and reflectively. This is a slightly speculative aspect of Hoffmeyer's argument, but it's very interesting to sort of follow her as she develops that idea. I think I'll read 2 paragraphs from the book that sort of add to the motivation for this study and for its approach to these issues. She begins by saying that there are currently rich legacies of scholarship on transnational histories of print. Yet these studies tend to operate in circumscribed areas: the transatlantic book trade, print and printers in the White Dominions, and media in British India. Studies of transnational religious publishing are likewise balkanized and tend to follow the watersheds of particular faiths. Accounts of Christian mission publishing in sub-Saharan Africa, for example, pay little attention to Indian diasporic print ventures or African commercial concerns, creating the impression that all printing in this region is of European Christian evangelical provenance. To complicate such views, one need only consider the printing sector in any of the major cities in southern or East Africa in which several diasporic groups intersected. In these settings, Muslim printers from Bombay, Africans tutored in Protestant evangelical presses, Indians and Britons trained in mission, state-run, or commercial printing concerns in the subcontinent. And British printers, as well as print workers from diasporic locales like Mauritius, converged. These journeymen shaped multilingual, multiracial, and multi-religious printing ventures, working with and against each other. So this is really the world that Hofmeyr has sort of caught sight of, and Indian opinion then becomes a focal point through which that excitingly heterogeneous world becomes visible. Next slide, please. Now, within the space of the periodical, Hofmeyr continues, Gandhi wished to create a notion of India as existing both territorially and deterritorially, meaning, among other things, that the detail, a particular text, could stand in for the whole. And I really think this makes a lot of sense. What she's trying to get at here is how Gandhi tried to sort of square the circle. He was positioned in South Africa. He struggled on behalf of the Indian population's rights. He was at this time very skeptical and even hostile towards the claims made by African groups. So he was working sort of in the name of something that was some community that converged sort of around the name India. But at the same time, it was physically very distant from India. So I think this is what Hofmeyr wants to get at here, that India is both territory, land, but it's also something more, and that something more becomes sort of visible on the pages of Indian opinion. Next slide. So I won't be spending a lot of time now exploring these literary examples. I'm just returning, first of all, to Still Life by Zoe Wickham, because now that you know more about the notion of the Black Atlantic, I think that novel and the ways in which Wickham sort of includes Mary Prince, the emancipated West Indian slave, as a character, can make more sense. You can see how this is, by one description, a Black Atlantic novel. And then we have, again, Albert Gurner. I've already mentioned how he, in his novels, invokes this Indian Ocean Muslim cosmopolis. And if there's any single of his novels, any single one of the novels I would sort of point to, if you want to explore this, would be By the Sea, which is the story of a refugee, a migrant in India, in Britain, sorry, and how this past then comes to have an impact on his life, and he recalls completely different world in Zanzibar. And then I'm also including Amitav Ghosh here as one of these Indian Ocean writers who's been extremely significant, I would say, even in making this making the importance of the Indian Ocean, the historical importance, evident. This was something he first did in that early novel, In an Antique Land, where there's one sort of historical narrative thread about a Jewish Tunisian merchant and his travels. Sea of Poppies, of course. This is the first book in his Ibis trilogy, and that novel and that trilogy is so much about the Indian Ocean and the cultures and lives of people on the ocean. Ghosh is very fond of the Lascars, for instance, the sailors who had really their own culture and their own idiom, and these could be people brought together on ship from all different parts of the Indian Ocean, and were the ones who really kept this this traffic going. So those are examples that I just invite you to explore more if you are interested in this angle. But let's next slide, please. Let's just reflect now a bit on the theoretical implications of what I've been saying, because in my previous lectures, and especially the first more theoretical lecture, I heavily emphasized how temporality can be narrated, and how that model of the space of experience and horizon of expectation provides a key whereby the specific quality of temporality can be described. Now, this is a slightly different, shall we say, literary take on the matter, and I'm sure you're familiar with Mikhail Bakhtin, the Russian philosopher and literary critic, who, with almost a 50-year delay, became known in the West through translation. But one of his key terms is the chronotope, and it's one of these terms that are very sort of suggestive and enticing, but also elusive. But nonetheless, this is what he says about the chronotope. In the literary artistic chronotope, spatial and temporal indicators are fused into one carefully thought out concrete whole. Time, as it were, thickens, takes on flesh, becomes artistically visible. Likewise, space becomes charged and responsive to the movements of time, plot, and history. The intersection of axes and fusion of indicators characterizes the artistic chronotope. So he's insisting on seeing this as really an aesthetic category, and that when we read literature, see plays, this becomes sort of an analytical term that makes it possible for us to see what's going on. I think one of these examples of a chronotope in popular culture has been the saloon in the American Western film. That's where so much comes together and drives the plot of those stories. But I would, since we in our first lecture agreed that there isn't an absolute line that is separating sort of factual history from fictional narrative. These two categories depend very much on one another. And so it is also with our a theoretical concept. So if we adopt concepts like the Black Atlantic and the Indian Ocean as shall we say frameworks for further investigation, I think it's fair to also call them chronotopes. So the Indian Ocean provides us with a very particular chronotope on a macro scale that makes certain histories visible and certainly makes histories that previously were invisible more visible. Next slide, please. So some of the implications of focusing on oceans is that this resists a nation-based history, and nation-based histories are almost by definition land-based histories. They also privilege connection and mobility rather than territorial belonging. So again, by adopting this chronotope, other things become visible, other things come into view and become important. And last but not least, the oceans as a theory chronotope makes visible the watered nature of the southern hemisphere. So in India, you live sort of in the southern part of a massive landmass, the Eurasian landmass. And then we have North America, which is also huge. And the distribution between land and sea is entirely different between the two hemispheres. So 80% of the southern hemisphere consists of ocean. And this is becoming significant in contemporary literary and cultural studies especially in South Africa and Australia, I would say. But it also leads towards the huge field of environmental humanities and how the focus on the oceans also provides another angle on the Anthropocene, which is so much discussed in environmental humanities. Next slide, please. So here are just a few reading suggestions if you want to look more closely into sort of oceanic studies. There's a book by Sharon Lavery, Writing Ocean Worlds, Indian Ocean Fiction in English. And then there's a chapter by Meg Samuelson in this handbook that I've edited, The Ocean, which is very informative, and I think it can be inspiring if you want to sort of develop this mode of analysis. Right, I think that's the last slide. Let's see, is there another slide? No. So that's the last one. That's what I had for today. But I have for the tutorials session, I've suggested to Viva that we see 15 minutes of a lecture by Isabel Hofmeyr that will repeat some of the points I've made, but also gives you a sense of how she works. And question is if we should have a 5-minute break the way we did yesterday and then resume. What do you say, Viva?
Yes, I think while we are watching the video, you can take a break and the students can continue watching. But they have left. I think some of them have left. All right, so we break for 5 minutes. So we break for 5 minutes.
Okay. And then just to clarify, in that video, I suggest that we watch from 6 minutes to 21 minutes.
Okay.
Because that's the beginning of her lecture. All right,
Yes.
but we'll resume in 5 minutes, quite simply. Thank you.
Okay. So you have noted, whoever is presenting the video, please make sure that you start it from the 6 minutes timestamp and it will
Yes,
go
ma'am.
until. Okay.
Okay.
So when we come
Thank you.
back, then you start this.
Yes, ma'am. Sure. Thank you.